give me a few words about Colonel Lawrence?
In the trenches, your Bedouin army, or whatever it calls itself, would be a sideshow of a sideshow.
I am Bedu.
Fire back at them!
Gordon of Khartoum. Alan.
Well, to me, it seems a place some men find their fun.
I was I'd be deuced able to get it back.
No pictures. You take no pictures.
That's for you, She-Cow. That's for Major Lawrence.
No 900 hours tomorrow? Ready. Fill it.
You'll get to Damascus before we do. Unless...
Not this.
Tell Sheriff on in there.
Hello friends, if you are looking for a complete and exciting recap of Lawrence of Arabia 1962, you have come to the right place. In today's video, we will follow the extraordinary journey of T.E. Lawrence, a British officer whose life takes an unexpected turn during World War I as he enters the vast deserts of Arabia, forms powerful alliances, and becomes deeply involved in the Arab Revolt against the Ottoman Empire. This is a story of war, ambition, identity, loyalty, and one man's struggle to understand where he truly belongs. So make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let's get started. The story begins with the death of T.E. Lawrence, whose life has already become surrounded by mystery and legend. After a motorcycle accident, the people attending his memorial service discuss him in very different ways. Some describe him as an extraordinary man, while others admit they never truly understood him. Even those who knew Lawrence personally seem unable to agree on who he really was. This opening immediately creates an important question. Was Lawrence a hero, an ambitious adventurer, a military genius, or simply a man who became lost inside the legend created around him? The story then moves back in time to the First World War. Lawrence is working as a British Army lieutenant in Cairo, but he does not fit the traditional image of a military officer. He is intelligent, curious, and far more interested in history, maps, languages, and the culture of the Middle East than in following strict military rules. His unusual behavior often irritates his superiors, yet his knowledge of Arabia makes him valuable. While the British are fighting the Ottoman Empire, they are also trying to understand how the Arab tribes might influence the larger war. Lawrence is eventually sent into the desert to meet Prince Faisal, one of the important leaders connected to the Arab Revolt. The mission appears simple: observe the situation and report back to the British command. Lawrence is not supposed to become deeply involved, but once he enters Arabia, the journey begins changing him. He travels across the enormous desert, leaving behind the familiar world of British military officers and entering a place where survival depends on knowledge, patience, and the people willing to guide you. During the journey, Lawrence meets Sharif Ali, a proud and powerful tribal leader. Their first encounter immediately reveals how dangerous and unfamiliar this new world is for Lawrence. Ali follows the customs and rules of the desert with complete seriousness, while Lawrence is still learning what those rules mean. Yet, despite their differences, the two men gradually develop a connection. Ali recognizes that Lawrence is unusual. Unlike many outsiders, he does not simply look down on the Arab people. He is genuinely interested in their history and culture. When Lawrence finally reaches Prince Faisal, he sees that the Arab forces are facing a difficult struggle. They want freedom from Ottoman control, but they are divided by tribal loyalties and lack the weapons and organization needed to defeat a powerful empire directly. British officials believe the Arabs can be useful in weakening the Ottoman forces, but Lawrence begins seeing something more. He believes that if the different tribes can work together, they may become capable of achieving something much larger than the British originally expect. Lawrence soon becomes fascinated by the idea of helping the Arabs create a unified force. He is especially interested in the strategic challenge of Aqaba, a heavily defended Ottoman port. Attacking it from the sea would be extremely difficult because of its strong defenses, but Lawrence begins imagining another possibility. What if the army could cross the dangerous Nefud desert and attack Aqaba from the direction nobody expects? The idea sounds almost impossible because the desert itself could destroy the entire group before they reach their destination. Prince Faisal listens to Lawrence's ideas with interest, while others remain doubtful. The journey across the desert would require extraordinary courage and careful planning. Lawrence, however, is becoming increasingly confident. The more time he spends in Arabia, the more he feels that his old identity is changing. He no longer wants to remain a distant British observer. He wants to take action and prove that the impossible journey can be completed. Sharif Ali eventually joins Lawrence in preparing for the dangerous expedition. Lawrence understands that he cannot succeed alone. He needs people who know the desert and trust one another. The group begins gathering the supplies and support needed for the journey, while the risk becomes clearer with every step. The Nefud is not simply an empty landscape, it is a deadly environment where heat, exhaustion, lack of water, and distance can defeat even the strongest travelers. As Lawrence prepares to enter the desert, he is standing at the beginning of a journey that will transform his entire life. The British officer who once seemed out of place in Cairo is beginning to discover a new purpose among people and places he once knew only through books and maps. He believes he can help change the course of the war, but he does not yet understand how deeply the war will change him in return. The road ahead leads toward Aqaba, but reaching it will require Lawrence and his companions to attempt something that many believe cannot be done. And as the desert stretches endlessly before them, Lawrence takes his first real step toward becoming the figure whose name will eventually become known far beyond Arabia. Lawrence and his companions begin the dangerous journey across the Nefud Desert, knowing that the success of their entire plan depends on reaching the other side alive. The desert seems endless, with enormous stretches of sand separating them from their destination. Lawrence remains determined, but the Arab tribesmen understand the environment far better than he does. They know where water may be found and how quickly conditions can change. For Lawrence, the journey becomes more than a military mission. It becomes a test of whether he can truly understand the world he has chosen to enter. Sharif Ali watches Lawrence carefully as they travel. At first, Ali remains skeptical of the British officer's confidence. Lawrence speaks boldly about crossing the desert and attacking Aqaba, but Ali knows that confidence alone cannot defeat the environment. Their relationship is still based partly on disagreement, yet Lawrence's willingness to share the hardships begins changing Ali's opinion of him. Lawrence does not demand special treatment simply because he is a British officer. Instead, he continues moving with the others and accepts the difficulties of the journey. The most dangerous part of the expedition comes when one of their companions becomes separated from the group. Lawrence realizes that leaving the man behind could mean certain death, but the others warn him that turning back could put everyone at risk. The decision becomes a test of Lawrence's character. He refuses to accept that the desert should decide the man's fate, and he turns back alone. His determination surprises the Arab tribesmen, who begin seeing him as someone willing to take risks for others rather than simply someone looking for glory. Lawrence eventually returns with the missing man, and the group continues its journey. The experience strengthens his reputation among the men. They begin believing that Lawrence possesses an unusual courage, even though they still do not fully understand him. Ali especially begins recognizing that the young officer is not behaving like the British commanders they have encountered before. Lawrence seems fascinated by the people around him and genuinely wants to earn their respect. The expedition finally approaches Aqaba from the desert side. Lawrence's strategy begins to prove itself. The Ottoman defenders are prepared for attacks from directions they consider predictable, but they are not expecting a large force to arrive through the desert. Lawrence and Ali help lead the Arab fighters toward the port, and the element of surprise gives them a tremendous advantage. What seemed almost impossible when they first discussed the plan now appears within reach. The attack on Aqaba becomes a major turning point in Lawrence's journey. The Arab forces succeed in taking the city, and the victory gives the revolt new momentum. Lawrence has achieved something that many believed could not be done. More importantly, he has gained the confidence of the Arab fighters. His name begins spreading among them, and he starts becoming more than a temporary British officer working with Prince Faisal. He is becoming a symbol of the possibility that the Arab Revolt can achieve meaningful victories. After Aqaba falls, Lawrence returns to the British side with important news. The victory demonstrates that the Arab forces can play a significant role against the Ottoman Empire. British commanders begin recognizing Lawrence's value, even though some remain skeptical of his unconventional methods. General Allenby sees potential in him and understands that Lawrence's influence among the Arab tribes could be extremely useful. Lawrence is given greater freedom to work with Faisal's forces, allowing him to continue operating in a way that would have been difficult for an ordinary officer. Lawrence's appearance also begins changing. He adopts elements of Arab clothing and becomes increasingly comfortable among the tribes. To the people around him, this makes him seem more connected to their world. For Lawrence himself, the clothing becomes symbolic of something deeper. He is beginning to feel that the desert gives him an identity that he cannot find within the rigid structure of the British military. The more time he spends away from Cairo, the less interested he becomes in returning to the person he was before the war. Yet the British still have their own interests in the region. They want the Arab Revolt to weaken the Ottoman Empire, but they also have plans for what will happen after the war. Lawrence begins to sense that the British promises of Arab independence may not be as straightforward as Faisal and the other leaders believe. This creates a conflict inside him. He wants to help the Arabs achieve freedom, but he is still serving a British government whose political goals may not completely match their dreams. Lawrence's growing influence also creates new tensions among the Arab leaders. Tribal loyalties remain powerful, and unity is difficult to maintain. Different groups have different priorities, and Lawrence must constantly find ways to convince them to cooperate. His ability to understand personalities becomes just as important as his military knowledge. He learns when to speak, when to remain silent, and when to allow the tribal leaders to believe that an idea was their own. Meanwhile, the Ottoman forces continue holding important positions throughout the region. Aqaba is only one victory, and the war is far from finished. Lawrence begins thinking about how the Arab forces can continue disrupting Ottoman communication and supply routes. Instead of trying to defeat large Ottoman armies directly, he sees an opportunity to attack the infrastructure that keeps those armies functioning. The strategy leads Lawrence toward a new kind of warfare. Small groups of Arab fighters can move quickly through the desert, strike unexpected targets, and disappear before a larger enemy force can respond. Lawrence understands that the desert gives them an advantage that a conventional army cannot easily overcome. His knowledge of the terrain grows, and his confidence increases with every successful operation. But success is beginning to change Lawrence as well. The attention he receives from the British and the Arab fighters feeds his growing belief that he can accomplish extraordinary things. He begins enjoying the freedom that comes from operating outside normal military restrictions. The man who once seemed eccentric and inexperienced now has followers who listen when he speaks. Sharif Ali remains one of the few people willing to challenge Lawrence when his confidence becomes excessive. Ali understands that war is unpredictable and that victory can disappear quickly. He respects Lawrence, but he does not worship him. Their friendship continues developing because Ali is willing to treat Lawrence honestly rather than simply praising him. Lawrence needs that honesty, even if he does not always appreciate hearing it. With Aqaba secured and the Arab Revolt gaining momentum, Lawrence now prepares for a new phase of the campaign. The British command wants him to continue supporting Faisal, while the Arab forces are looking toward larger victories. Lawrence believes that the next attacks can weaken Ottoman control even further. But the greater Lawrence's influence becomes, the greater the danger becomes as well. He has crossed the desert, captured Aqaba, and earned the trust of men who once doubted him. Now he must discover whether he can turn those victories into something that could change the entire course of the Arab Revolt. After the victory at Aqaba, Lawrence's reputation grows rapidly among the Arab fighters. What began as a mission to assist Prince Faisal has now become something much larger. Lawrence has proven that the Arab forces can achieve victories by using the desert to their advantage, and the British command begins seeing him as an important link between their army and the Arab Revolt. Allenby gives Lawrence greater freedom, allowing him to continue working with Faisal while disrupting Ottoman control across the region. Lawrence becomes increasingly comfortable leading the Arab fighters. He understands that they cannot defeat the Ottoman army through conventional battles, so he encourages them to strike railway lines, supply routes, and communication points. These attacks may appear small compared with major battles, but they create constant problems for the Ottoman forces. Trains carrying supplies are disrupted, soldiers are forced to protect long stretches of railway, and Ottoman commanders become uncertain about where the next attack will come from. Sharif Ali remains close to Lawrence throughout these operations. Their friendship has grown stronger since Aqaba, but Ali continues to remind Lawrence that the desert belongs to the tribes who have lived there for generations. Lawrence may be talented and fearless, but he still has much to learn. Ali's presence gives Lawrence someone he can trust, while Lawrence's growing confidence sometimes makes him forget how dangerous his position has become. Lawrence also begins working closely with Auda Abu Tai, the powerful leader of the Howeita tribe. Auda is proud, independent, and motivated by his own interests. He is not easily convinced to support another man's plan, but Lawrence understands how to appeal to his ambitions. Their alliance gives the Arab forces additional strength, although Lawrence knows that keeping different tribal leaders united will remain one of his greatest challenges. The attacks on the Ottoman railway become increasingly successful. Lawrence and the Arab fighters move quickly through the desert, destroy sections of the railway, and disappear before large Ottoman forces can respond. Their tactics frustrate the enemy and create the impression that the Arabs are everywhere. Lawrence begins to understand that psychological pressure can be just as important as physical damage. If the Ottoman soldiers never know where an attack will happen, they are forced to spread themselves thin. Meanwhile, the British continue their own military campaign. Allenby's forces are preparing for major operations, and the Arab Revolt is expected to support the larger British advance. Lawrence realizes that his work is becoming part of a much bigger strategy. The Arabs want independence, while the British want victory over the Ottoman Empire and control over important territories. For now, their goals overlap, but Lawrence begins wondering how long that cooperation can last. Lawrence's transformation becomes more noticeable to those around him. He is no longer simply a British officer wearing Arab clothing for practical reasons. He has begun embracing the identity and freedom associated with the desert. He speaks confidently with tribal leaders and moves through their camps as though he belongs there. His growing popularity gives him influence, but it also creates a dangerous sense of personal power. One evening, Lawrence reflects on the strange position he now occupies. To the British, he is still an officer working for their interests. To many Arab fighters, he is becoming a leader and symbol of their struggle. Lawrence enjoys being accepted by the Arab people, yet he knows that he is still connected to Britain. The contradiction becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. As the campaign continues, Lawrence takes greater risks. He believes that bold action can keep the Ottoman forces under pressure and help the British advance. His confidence inspires the men around him, but some begin worrying that he is pushing himself and the others too far. Ali especially understands that Lawrence's desire to achieve something extraordinary could eventually lead him into serious danger. The Ottoman response also becomes stronger. Their commanders recognize that the railway attacks are damaging their ability to move supplies and troops efficiently. They begin increasing patrols and sending soldiers into areas where they believe Lawrence's forces may be operating. The desert, which once seemed like Lawrence's greatest advantage, could become a trap if the enemy learns how to predict his movements. Lawrence refuses to slow down. He believes the Arab revolt needs momentum, and he wants to prove that the Ottoman forces can be pushed out of the region. His plans become increasingly ambitious, and the distance between Lawrence, the British officer, and Lawrence the Arab revolutionary continues growing. The Arab fighters admire his courage, but they also begin following him with expectations that may become difficult to satisfy. Lawrence has encouraged them to believe that freedom is within reach. He knows that the political situation is more complicated than they realize, but he continues supporting their hopes because he believes their unity is essential to victory. The campaign eventually moves toward another major confrontation. Lawrence's forces are preparing for an operation that could further weaken Ottoman control, but the risks are greater than before. The enemy is now actively searching for the man whose name has become associated with the Arab attacks. Lawrence understands that his reputation has become both a weapon and a weakness. The legend surrounding him inspires his allies, but it also makes him a valuable target. As the Arab Revolt pushes forward, Lawrence prepares to enter another dangerous chapter of the war, unaware that his confidence and growing fame will soon test the limits of his courage. The Arab Revolt continues gaining momentum, and Lawrence now finds himself at the center of a campaign that has become far more ambitious than the mission he was originally given. His attacks on Ottoman railway lines have disrupted supplies and communication, while the Arab fighters have gained confidence from their victories. But Lawrence understands that success has also made the Ottoman forces more determined to stop him. The enemy is no longer treating the attacks as isolated incidents. They are searching for the man behind them, and Lawrence knows that eventually his luck will be tested. Lawrence continues moving through the desert with Sharif Ali and the Arab fighters, using speed and surprise instead of trying to match the Ottoman army in conventional combat. Every successful attack strengthens his reputation. Stories about his courage spread among the tribes, and the name Lawrence of Arabia begins becoming a symbol of the revolt. Lawrence enjoys the admiration, but there is also something dangerous about becoming a legend while the war is still happening. People begin expecting him to accomplish things that no ordinary commander could guarantee. Meanwhile, the British command sees Lawrence's growing influence as useful. General Allenby understands that Lawrence can encourage the Arab forces to support the larger British campaign. Yet, the relationship between Lawrence and his British superiors remains complicated. Lawrence wants the Arabs to believe that their sacrifices will lead to independence, while British political interests are not necessarily identical to the promises being made to the Arab leaders. Lawrence senses this contradiction, but he continues working because he believes victory must come first. Prince Faisal also becomes increasingly important in the campaign. He understands that military success alone will not guarantee the future he wants for his people. The Arab tribes must remain united long enough to establish themselves politically after the Ottoman Empire is defeated. Faisal trusts Lawrence's abilities, but he also understands that Lawrence is still connected to Britain. Their relationship is therefore based on cooperation as well as uncertainty. Lawrence begins planning operations that will create even greater problems for the Ottoman forces. His strategy is to keep them constantly reacting, forcing them to protect railways, roads, and isolated positions while the Arab fighters move freely through the desert. The approach works because the Ottoman army has far more soldiers and equipment, but those advantages become less useful when they cannot predict where the next attack will happen. Sharif Ali remains one of Lawrence's closest companions, but he notices that Lawrence is becoming increasingly confident. Ali respects his courage, yet he worries that Lawrence is beginning to believe too strongly in his own legend. The desert has given Lawrence a sense of freedom unlike anything he experienced in the British military, but that freedom also encourages him to take risks without fully considering the consequences. One operation takes Lawrence and his men close to a dangerous Ottoman position. The group must move carefully because enemy patrols are searching the area. Lawrence remains calm, studying the landscape and waiting for the right moment to act. His ability to remain composed under pressure inspires the men around him, but Ali understands that one mistake could leave them surrounded. The operation succeeds, but the victory comes with a reminder that the war is becoming increasingly brutal. Lawrence sees the consequences of the fighting and begins struggling with the difference between the romantic image of war and its actual reality. He has become fascinated by the idea of freedom and rebellion, yet he is also becoming more aware of the suffering created by the conflict. The experience leaves a deeper impression on him than he allows others to see. As Lawrence's reputation grows, journalists and British officials become interested in his story. The image of the mischievous British officer living among the Arabs becomes useful for propaganda. Lawrence understands that the British can use his popularity to encourage support for the war. At the same time, he begins realizing that the legend being created around him is not entirely under his control. People are turning him into a symbol, while the real Lawrence remains far more complicated. Auda Abu Tai continues providing support, but tribal politics remain a constant challenge. The Arab fighters are not one unified army with a single set of goals. Each tribe has its own interests, rivalries, and expectations. Lawrence must constantly negotiate between these groups using diplomacy as much as military strategy. He learns that leading people is not simply about giving orders, it requires understanding what motivates them. The British advance begins moving closer to major Ottoman positions, and Lawrence recognizes that the Arab Revolt has become an important part of the larger campaign. The destruction of Ottoman communication lines has weakened their ability to respond quickly, giving the British forces greater opportunities. Lawrence feels proud of what the Arab fighters have accomplished, but he also worries about what will happen once the war ends. He begins thinking more seriously about the promises made to Faisal and the Arab leaders. If Britain and France have their own plans for the region, what will happen to the independence the Arabs believe they are fighting for? Lawrence does not yet have a clear answer. He is caught between loyalty to Britain, friendship with Faisal, and his growing emotional connection to the Arab cause. The pressure eventually reaches Lawrence personally. The Ottoman forces have begun gathering information about him, and his movements become more dangerous. The men around him warn that he cannot continue assuming every operation will succeed. Lawrence listens, but his confidence remains strong. He believes that the revolt has reached a point where stopping would be more dangerous than continuing. Then a new mission presents itself, one that will take Lawrence deeper into enemy territory and put him closer than ever to the consequences of the war. He prepares to move forward with Ali and the Arab fighters, believing that another victory could help push the Ottoman forces toward collapse. But Lawrence does not realize that this mission will test not only his military abilities but also his understanding of himself. The legend of Lawrence of Arabia is growing, and soon the man behind the legend will face a moment that changes everything. Lawrence's growing reputation now carries him deeper into the war than ever before. He has become an important figure among the Arab fighters, and his victories have given the revolt a confidence it did not possess at the beginning. But the closer Lawrence gets to the heart of the conflict, the more complicated his position becomes. He is still technically serving British interests, yet his emotional connection to the Arab cause is becoming stronger. He wants the Arab people to believe that their sacrifices will lead to independence, but he is beginning to sense that powerful governments may have plans of their own. After the successful operations against the Ottoman railway, Lawrence and the Arab forces continued disrupting enemy communications. Their attacks forced Ottoman commanders to spread their troops across the desert, protecting supply routes that can be destroyed again at any moment. Lawrence understands that this strategy allows a relatively small force to create problems for a much larger army. The desert gives the Arabs mobility, while the Ottoman forces are forced to defend fixed positions and long stretches of railway. Every successful attack increases Lawrence's confidence in the strategy. Sharif Ali remains at Lawrence's side, but their relationship becomes more complicated as Lawrence's personality changes. Ali has always respected Lawrence's courage, but he also sees the danger of the young officer becoming too confident. Lawrence enjoys the freedom he has found in the desert, and he increasingly behaves as though ordinary military rules no longer apply to him. Ali tries to remind him that courage without caution can become recklessness. Lawrence listens, but his growing reputation makes it harder for him to accept limitations. Lawrence also continues working with Prince Faisal, who has become increasingly dependent on the success of the Arab campaign. Faisal understands that the revolt must achieve military victories before the Ottoman Empire can be pushed out of the region. But he also knows that political negotiations will eventually determine what happens afterward. Lawrence shares Faisal's desire for Arab independence, yet he remains uncertain about how much influence Britain will allow the Arab leaders to have once the war is over. The political tension becomes more noticeable when Lawrence begins hearing discussions about British and French interests in the Middle East. He realizes that the promises being made during the war may not be as simple as he once believed. The Arab fighters are risking their lives because they believe they are fighting for their own future, while European powers are thinking about borders, influence, and strategic territory. Lawrence begins feeling caught between two worlds. Despite these doubts, Lawrence continues leading attacks. He knows that the Arab revolt cannot stop while the Ottoman forces remain strong. His ability to move quickly through the desert allows him to strike unexpected targets and disappear before the enemy can respond. The fighters begin trusting his judgment, and his influence among the tribes grows even further. One operation takes Lawrence and his men near an Ottoman train route. They carefully approach the railway and prepare another attack designed to disrupt supplies. The operation demonstrates how effective their tactics have become. The Ottoman soldiers are forced to react to an enemy they cannot easily locate, while Lawrence's fighters disappear back into the desert. These victories make the revolt appear larger and more powerful than it actually is. But Lawrence is beginning to realize that military success comes with a personal cost. The violence of the war has affected him deeply, even though he rarely discusses his feelings. He has seen people suffer and has participated in decisions that place lives at risk. The romantic image of adventure that once attracted him is becoming harder to maintain. The desert still gives him a sense of freedom, but the war itself is becoming increasingly difficult for him to romanticize. As the British advance continues, Lawrence's role becomes more important. Allenby understands that Lawrence's influence can help coordinate the Arab forces with British military objectives. Lawrence is given more responsibility and he begins moving between Arab and British commanders. His ability to communicate with both sides makes him valuable, but it also increases the pressure on him. Everyone expects him to deliver results. The Arab fighters also begin viewing Lawrence as more than an advisor. His victories have made him a symbol of their struggle. Some men believe he possesses almost extraordinary qualities, while others simply respect him because he has shared their hardships. Lawrence enjoys the admiration, but deep down he understands that the image being created around him is larger than the real person. This becomes especially important as Lawrence starts questioning his own identity. He has spent so much time living among the Arab tribes that he sometimes feels more comfortable with them than with the British officers who originally sent him into the desert. Yet, he cannot completely become one of them. His background, nationality, and responsibilities remain part of who he is. He is caught between belonging and separation. Sharif Ali sees this conflict developing inside Lawrence. Ali does not always understand why Lawrence pushes himself so hard, but he recognizes that the young officer is searching for something beyond military victory. Lawrence wants to prove something to himself as much as he wants to defeat the Ottoman forces. His confidence sometimes looks like ambition, but underneath it is a need to discover who he really is. Meanwhile, the Ottoman forces are becoming increasingly determined to stop him. Lawrence's repeated attacks have damaged their supply system and embarrassed their commanders. They begin increasing patrols and gathering information about his movements. Lawrence knows that the enemy is adapting, but he continues believing that surprise and mobility will keep his forces ahead. The campaign eventually brings Lawrence toward another dangerous operation. The mission could create a major advantage for the Arab Revolt, but it will also place him in territory where the enemy has greater control. Lawrence understands the danger but believes the opportunity is too important to ignore. As preparations begin, Ali warns him once again to be careful. Lawrence accepts the warning but remains determined. He believes that the Arab Revolt has reached a critical point and that another major success could bring them closer to their goal. Lawrence rides forward into the desert with the weight of the entire campaign beginning to rest on his shoulders. He has become a hero to the Arab fighters, a valuable officer to the British, and a symbol of rebellion to people far beyond the desert. But the next stage of the war will force Lawrence to discover that becoming a legend can carry a price far greater than he ever imagined. Lawrence continues deeper into the Arab Revolt, but the confidence that once made him seem unstoppable is beginning to meet the harsh reality of war. His victories against the Ottoman railway have made him famous among the Arab fighters and useful to the British command. Yet the pressure surrounding him keeps increasing. Every operation now carries greater consequences, and Lawrence knows that the Ottoman forces are actively searching for ways to stop him. Still, he remains determined to keep the revolt moving forward and believes that the desert can continue giving the Arab forces an advantage. The Arab fighters prepare for another dangerous operation, relying on Lawrence's knowledge of the enemy and their own understanding of the desert. Lawrence moves between different groups, trying to keep the tribal leaders focused on their common goal. Unity is difficult because every tribe has its own interests, but Lawrence has learned how to bring them together when necessary. His influence allows him to persuade men who would normally refuse to follow another tribe's leader, yet he also understands that their loyalty cannot be taken for granted. Sharif Ali remains his closest companion during these difficult operations. Ali has watched Lawrence change from an inexperienced British officer into a confident desert leader. He respects what Lawrence has accomplished, but he is increasingly concerned about the risks Lawrence is willing to take. Lawrence sometimes appears to believe that he can control every situation through courage and determination. Ali knows that the desert and the war do not care about reputation. A single mistake can destroy everything. The Arab forces continue attacking Ottoman positions and communication routes. Their strategy remains effective because they refuse to fight on the enemy's terms. Instead of confronting large Ottoman armies directly, they strike vulnerable locations and disappear into the vast desert. Lawrence understands that every disrupted supply line forces the Ottoman commanders to spend more resources protecting their infrastructure. The campaign becomes a constant struggle of movement, patience, and surprise. As the British advance grows stronger, Lawrence receives more information about the larger military situation. Allenby's forces are preparing for major operations against the Ottoman positions, and the Arab Revolt is expected to support the advance. Lawrence realizes that the time for smaller victories may soon be ending. The Arab fighters will eventually need to enter larger strategic plans, and the political consequences of their success will become impossible to ignore. Lawrence's relationship with the British command becomes increasingly complicated. He wants to help the Arabs achieve their own future, but he knows that Britain has strategic interests in the region. He begins questioning whether the promises made to Faisal can actually be fulfilled. The possibility that the Arab people could fight for freedom only to have foreign powers decide their future troubles him deeply. Despite these doubts, Lawrence continues his work. His ability to inspire the Arab fighters remains one of his greatest strengths. He speaks to them as partners rather than subjects, and many believe that he genuinely respects their cause. His clothing, manner, and willingness to share their hardships make him appear almost completely transformed from the officer who first entered the desert. However, Lawrence's growing legend also begins creating problems. People start expecting him to succeed in every situation. His reputation encourages the fighters, but it also creates pressure that he cannot easily escape. Lawrence knows that he is still human, yet the people around him increasingly treat him as though he is capable of extraordinary things. During one operation, Lawrence and the Arab fighters encounter serious resistance. The enemy is better prepared than expected, forcing Lawrence to reconsider his approach. The experience reminds him that the Ottoman forces are learning from previous attacks. They are no longer simply reacting, they are beginning to understand how Lawrence operates. Lawrence becomes more cautious, but he refuses to abandon his strategy. He studies the enemy's movements and looks for another opportunity. His greatest advantage remains unpredictability. As long as the Ottoman commanders cannot determine where he will strike next, they will struggle to protect every possible target. Meanwhile, Prince Faisal continues working toward the political future of the Arab Revolt. He understands that military victories must eventually translate into political influence. Lawrence supports him, but he is becoming increasingly aware of the gap between what the Arab fighters want and what the European powers may be willing to provide. The tension affects Lawrence personally. He has begun to identify strongly with the Arab cause, but he cannot completely escape his British identity. He is admired by the Arabs and respected by British commanders, yet he belongs fully to neither world. The desert has given him a new sense of purpose, but it has also created a conflict within him that becomes harder to ignore. Ali notices Lawrence's changing behavior and tries to keep him grounded. Their friendship is built on mutual respect, but Ali is not afraid to challenge Lawrence when he believes his friend is making dangerous choices. Lawrence appreciates Ali's honesty even when he does not want to hear it. As the war moves toward its decisive stage, Lawrence begins preparing for a much larger operation. The Ottoman forces are weakening, but they remain dangerous. The Arab fighters must coordinate with the British advance if they want to take advantage of the changing situation. Lawrence understands that the next phase will be different from everything that came before. The small desert raids helped build the revolt, but now the movement is approaching the major cities and political centers that will determine the future of Arabia. He looks across the desert and realizes how far he has traveled from the young officer who first arrived in Cairo. He has become a leader, a symbol, and a legend. But the closer the war comes to victory, the more Lawrence will have to confront the complicated truth behind the promises of independence. And soon, the battlefield will move toward a final confrontation that will test everything he has built. Lawrence continues deeper into the Arab Revolt, but the confidence that once made him seem unstoppable is beginning to meet the harsh reality of war. His victories against the Ottoman railway have made him famous among the Arab fighters and useful to the British command. Yet the pressure surrounding him keeps increasing. Every operation now carries greater consequences, and Lawrence knows that the Ottoman forces are actively searching for ways to stop him. Still, he remains determined to keep the revolt moving forward and believes that the desert can continue giving the Arab forces an advantage. The Arab fighters prepare for another dangerous operation, relying on Lawrence's knowledge of the enemy and their own understanding of the desert. Lawrence moves between different groups, trying to keep the tribal leaders focused on their common goal. Unity is difficult because every tribe has its own interests, but Lawrence has learned how to bring them together when necessary. His influence allows him to persuade men who would normally refuse to follow another tribe's leader, yet he also understands that their loyalty cannot be taken for granted. Sharif Ali remains his closest companion during these difficult operations. Ali has watched Lawrence change from an inexperienced British officer into a confident desert leader. He respects what Lawrence has accomplished, but he is increasingly concerned about the risks Lawrence is willing to take. Lawrence sometimes appears to believe that he can control every situation through courage and determination. Ali knows that the desert and the war do not care about reputation. A single mistake can destroy everything. The Arab forces continue attacking Ottoman positions and communication routes. Their strategy remains effective because they refuse to fight on the enemy's terms. Instead of confronting large Ottoman armies directly, they strike vulnerable locations and disappear into the vast desert. Lawrence understands that every disrupted supply line forces the Ottoman commanders to spend more resources protecting their infrastructure. The campaign becomes a constant struggle of movement, patience, and surprise. As the British advance grows stronger, Lawrence receives more information about the larger military situation. Allenby's forces are preparing for major operations against the Ottoman positions, and the Arab Revolt is expected to support the advance. Lawrence realizes that the time for smaller victories may soon be ending. The Arab fighters will eventually need to enter larger strategic plans, and the political consequences of their success will become impossible to ignore. Lawrence's relationship with the British command becomes increasingly complicated. He wants to help the Arabs achieve their own future, but he knows that Britain has strategic interests in the region. He begins questioning whether the promises made to Faisal can actually be fulfilled. The possibility that the Arab people could fight for freedom only to have foreign powers decide their future troubles him deeply. Despite these doubts, Lawrence continues his work. His ability to inspire the Arab fighters remains one of his greatest strengths. He speaks to them as partners rather than subjects, and many believe that he genuinely respects their cause. His clothing, manner, and willingness to share their hardships make him appear almost completely transformed from the officer who first entered the desert. However, Lawrence's growing legend also begins creating problems. People start expecting him to succeed in every situation. His reputation encourages the fighters, but it also creates pressure that he cannot easily escape. Lawrence knows that he is still human, yet the people around him increasingly treat him as though he is capable of extraordinary things. During one operation, Lawrence and the Arab fighters encounter serious resistance. The enemy is better prepared than expected, forcing Lawrence to reconsider his approach. The experience reminds him that the Ottoman forces are learning from previous attacks. They are no longer simply reacting, they are beginning to understand how Lawrence operates. Lawrence becomes more cautious, but he refuses to abandon his strategy. He studies the enemy's movements and looks for another opportunity. His greatest advantage remains unpredictability. As long as the Ottoman commanders cannot determine where he will strike next, they will struggle to protect every possible target. Meanwhile, Prince Faisal continues working toward the political future of the Arab Revolt. He understands that military victories must eventually translate into political influence. Lawrence supports him, but he is becoming increasingly aware of the gap between what the Arab fighters want and what the European powers may be willing to provide. The tension affects Lawrence personally. He has begun to identify strongly with the Arab cause, but he cannot completely escape his British identity. He is admired by the Arabs and respected by British commanders, yet he belongs fully to neither world. The desert has given him a new sense of purpose, but it has also created a conflict within him that becomes harder to ignore. Ali notices Lawrence's changing behavior and tries to keep him grounded. Their friendship is built on mutual respect, but Ali is not afraid to challenge Lawrence when he believes his friend is making dangerous choices. Lawrence appreciates Ali's honesty even when he does not want to hear it. As the war moves toward its decisive stage, Lawrence begins preparing for a much larger operation. The Ottoman forces are weakening, but they remain dangerous. The Arab fighters must coordinate with the British advance if they want to take advantage of the changing situation. Lawrence understands that the next phase will be different from everything that came before. The small desert raids helped build the revolt, but now the movement is approaching the major cities and political centers that will determine the future of Arabia. He looks across the desert and realizes how far he has traveled from the young officer who first arrived in Cairo. He has become a leader, a symbol, and a legend. But the closer the war comes to victory, the more Lawrence will have to confront the complicated truth behind the promises of independence. And soon, the battlefield will move toward a final confrontation that will test everything he has built. The campaign now moves toward Damascus, and Lawrence knows that the Arab forces are approaching the most important stage of their entire struggle. The Ottoman army is weakening, but the city remains a major prize. Lawrence wants Faisal's forces to reach Damascus with enough strength and influence to ensure that the Arab revolt will have a meaningful voice when the war ends. The journey is no longer simply about defeating the Ottoman Empire. It is about what happens after that victory. Lawrence and his Arab companions continue advancing, while the British army pushes forward from another direction. The Ottoman forces begin retreating, leaving behind positions that once seemed impossible to overcome. Lawrence sees the collapse of Ottoman authority firsthand. But instead of simply celebrating, he becomes increasingly focused on reaching Damascus before the opportunity disappears. He knows that whoever controls the city first may gain an important advantage in the political struggle that follows. Sharif Ali remains with Lawrence as the campaign becomes more intense. Their friendship has survived countless dangers, but Ali can see that Lawrence is becoming increasingly consumed by the idea of reaching Damascus. Lawrence has spent years fighting for the Arab cause, and he now believes that the final victory will determine whether all those sacrifices meant something. Ali tries to remind him that the political future cannot be controlled by one man, but Lawrence remains determined. The Arab fighters continue moving through the countryside as Ottoman authority breaks apart. Some soldiers surrender while others retreat toward Damascus. The chaos gives Lawrence an opportunity to push forward quickly, but it also creates new problems. The Arab tribes are not a single organized army, and each group has its own ideas about what should happen once they enter the city. Lawrence must keep them focused on their common objective while preventing rivalries from destroying their unity. As they approach Damascus, Lawrence sees the possibility of a historic moment. For years, the Arab people have fought against Ottoman control, and now the empire that ruled the region is collapsing. Lawrence believes the city could become the foundation of a new Arab political order. Faisal shares this hope, but both men understand that British and French interests may complicate everything. The British command is also approaching Damascus. Allenby's forces have played a major role in defeating the Ottoman army, and the British have their own plans for the region. Lawrence begins realizing that even if Faisal reaches the city first, political negotiations may ultimately determine what happens next. The promises made during the war are becoming increasingly difficult to separate from the strategic interests of the European powers. Lawrence's confidence begins turning into frustration. He has spent years believing that his actions could help shape the future, but now he is confronted with forces much larger than himself. Governments, diplomats, military commanders, and political agreements may have more influence over the future of Arabia than anything he can accomplish on the battlefield. Still, Lawrence refuses to surrender his objective. He continues helping the Arab forces move toward Damascus, encouraging the fighters to remain united. His reputation remains powerful, and many men follow him because they believe he represents the possibility of independence. Lawrence understands the responsibility attached to that belief, even though he is increasingly uncertain about what he can actually deliver. The Ottoman retreat creates moments of confusion and destruction along the way. Lawrence and his companions encounter the consequences of an army collapsing under pressure. The war that once seemed like a grand adventure now appears far more complicated. Lawrence has witnessed courage, sacrifice, betrayal, and suffering, and these experiences have changed the way he sees himself. As the Arab forces finally reach Damascus, the city becomes the center of a political struggle. Lawrence and Faisal want the Arabs to take control and establish their own administration. They begin organizing the city and attempting to maintain order. But the situation is far more complicated than they expected. Different groups have different expectations, and the arrival of British forces creates uncertainty about who truly holds authority. Lawrence tries to help organize the new administration, but the difficulties quickly become obvious. The Arab forces are not prepared to manage every responsibility of a major city, and the political disagreements among their leaders become increasingly difficult to overcome. Lawrence's military skills cannot solve every problem. He has spent years learning how to defeat an enemy, but now he must deal with administration, politics, and competing interests. Faisal remains determined to establish Arab authority, but he also understands that he cannot ignore the British. The alliance that helped defeat the Ottomans now becomes a source of tension. Lawrence is caught in the middle, knowing that he has encouraged the Arab fighters to believe in independence while being unable to guarantee that Britain will honor every promise. The arrival of British officials makes the situation even more difficult. Lawrence realizes that his influence has limits. He may have become a legendary figure among the Arab fighters, but he is still only one man operating within a much larger political system. The future of the region will be decided by people who may never have experienced the hardships of the desert. For Lawrence, this is one of the most painful realizations of the entire war. He had believed that courage and military success could create freedom. Now he sees that victory on the battlefield does not automatically translate into political independence. The dream he fought for is beginning to slip beyond his control. As Damascus stands at the center of the changing Middle East, Lawrence is forced to confront the difference between the legend people have created around him and the reality of what one man can accomplish. He has helped bring down an empire, but now he must face the consequences of the political world that comes after the war. With Damascus finally under Arab control, Lawrence discovers that the victory he imagined would bring unity and independence is much more complicated than he expected. The city is filled with political disagreements, competing interests, and practical problems that cannot be solved simply through military courage. Lawrence has helped lead the Arab forces across the desert and played an important role in defeating Ottoman authority. But now he must confront a different kind of battle. The battlefield gave him clear enemies, while politics gives him uncertainty. Prince Faisal wants to establish a functioning Arab government in Damascus, but the situation is difficult from the beginning. The different groups involved in the revolt do not always agree about how the city should be governed. Tribal loyalties and political ambitions begin competing with the larger dream of Arab unity. Lawrence tries to help organize the situation, but he quickly realizes that the skills that made him successful in the desert are not enough to solve every political problem. The British presence also becomes increasingly important. Lawrence knows that Britain played a major role in defeating the Ottoman forces, but he is troubled by the possibility that the Arab people will not receive the independence they were promised. During the war, he encouraged Faisal and the Arab fighters to believe that their sacrifices would lead to freedom. Now that victory has arrived, Lawrence can see that powerful governments are making decisions about the region according to their own interests. Lawrence becomes frustrated as he realizes that the political future of Arabia is being discussed by people who did not fight alongside the Arab tribes. He had imagined that the people who fought for their homeland would be allowed to determine what happened next. Instead, he begins seeing negotiations and competing claims that could divide the territory they had struggled to liberate. Sharif Ali remains close to Lawrence, but even their relationship is affected by the changing circumstances. Ali understands the disappointment Lawrence is experiencing, yet he also recognizes that the political world has always been more complicated than the romantic vision Lawrence carried into the desert. Ali has never believed that one victory could solve every problem. He reminds Lawrence, through his actions and words, that the Arab people must ultimately decide how they will continue their struggle. Lawrence's own position becomes increasingly uncomfortable. To the Arabs, he is a symbol of the revolt, but to the British, he remains an officer who has completed an important military mission. His popularity cannot change the political agreements being discussed behind closed doors. Lawrence begins to understand that his influence was strongest when the war was being fought. Now that diplomats and politicians have taken control, his ability to shape events is rapidly disappearing. The realization deeply affects him. Lawrence had spent years building an identity in the desert, believing that he could help create something meaningful. The freedom he experienced among the Arab fighters had given him a sense of purpose that he had never found in the British military. But now the war is ending, and he must return to a world where he no longer knows exactly where he belongs. The British authorities begin preparing for the next stage, and Lawrence is gradually pulled away from the Arab leadership. He understands that his role is changing. The man who once rode beside tribal fighters and planned attacks against Ottoman positions is now being treated as an officer whose assignment is essentially finished. Faisal continues trying to secure a political future for his people, but the larger powers have their own plans. Lawrence wants to help him, yet he has limited influence over the negotiations. The realization is painful because Lawrence knows that he helped convince the Arabs to fight with the expectation that their independence would be recognized. As the political situation becomes more complicated, Lawrence's legendary image begins separating from the real person. Newspapers and military reports have already transformed his achievements into a larger than life story. The public sees a heroic figure who crossed deserts, led Arab fighters, and helped defeat the Ottoman Empire. But Lawrence himself knows about the fear, confusion, mistakes, and suffering behind the legend. He begins questioning what his achievements actually mean. Did he truly help create freedom, or did he simply help one empire defeat another? Did the Arab fighters gain what they were promised, or were they being moved into another political struggle? These questions become increasingly difficult for Lawrence to ignore. His emotional connection to Arabia remains strong, but the war has changed him too deeply to allow him to return to his previous life without difficulty. He has experienced a level of freedom and influence that ordinary military life cannot provide. At the same time, he has seen enough violence and political manipulation to understand that the romantic image of war was never the complete truth. Eventually, Lawrence is called away from the Arab campaign. His time as the famous desert leader is coming to an end. The Arab fighters who once followed him must continue their struggle without him, while Faisal faces the political challenges that Lawrence cannot solve. Lawrence leaves with mixed feelings. He has achieved extraordinary military success, but he also feels that the political promises surrounding the revolt are slipping away. The victory that once seemed like the beginning of a new world now feels incomplete. As he prepares to return to British authority, Lawrence looks back on the journey that transformed him. He entered Arabia as an unusual young officer searching for adventure and purpose. He leaves as a man who has become famous across the world but is still uncertain about his own identity. The desert gave Lawrence a name, the war gave him a legend, but the peace is about to force him to discover who he really is without either one. Lawrence's time in Arabia is beginning to come to an end, but the consequences of the war continue following him. The man who once dreamed of helping create an independent Arab future now finds himself watching political decisions unfold beyond his control. His military achievements have made him famous, yet the fame cannot hide his disappointment. He knows that the Arab fighters sacrificed enormously during the revolt, and he fears that the promises made to them may not be fulfilled in the way they expected. After leaving the desert campaign, Lawrence returns toward the British military world he once knew. But he is no longer the same person who entered it. He has spent years living among Arab tribes, fighting alongside them, and sharing their hopes. The strict structure of the British Army now feels strangely distant. Lawrence has become accustomed to the freedom of the desert, and returning to ordinary military life feels like losing a part of himself. British officials recognize his achievements and treat him as an important figure. Reports about his role in the Arab Revolt continue spreading, and Lawrence's reputation grows beyond anything he could have imagined. His story becomes fascinating to journalists, politicians, and military officers. He is increasingly described as an extraordinary hero who accomplished almost impossible things in the desert. Yet, Lawrence is uncomfortable with the growing legend because he knows that the real story is far more complicated. The public image presents Lawrence as fearless and almost unstoppable. It focuses on his victories, his friendship with the Arab fighters, and his ability to lead men through the desert. But Lawrence remembers the mistakes, losses, political disappointments, and personal struggles that accompanied those victories. The difference between the legend and the man begins becoming one of the central conflicts of his life. Lawrence's relationship with the British authorities also becomes complicated because he knows they were never completely honest about their political intentions. During the revolt, he helped convince Faisal and the Arab fighters that they were fighting toward independence. After the war, however, European powers begin making decisions about the region according to their own interests. Lawrence feels responsible because he was one of the people who encouraged the Arabs to believe in a better future. He tries to find ways to influence the political situation, but his power is limited. Lawrence is a soldier and advisor, not a government leader. His personal popularity cannot replace official authority. He realizes that the same governments that praised his military achievements are not necessarily willing to follow the vision he developed in the desert. Prince Faisal continues pursuing political opportunities, and Lawrence remains sympathetic to his cause. Their friendship has survived the difficulties of the war, but Lawrence is no longer able to stand beside him in the same way. The revolt has ended, and the political struggle has entered a new phase in which diplomacy and international agreements matter more than battlefield victories. Lawrence begins feeling increasingly disconnected from the world around him. He has experienced a life that was extraordinary by almost any standard, yet he cannot easily explain what he wants next. Returning to ordinary military duties seems meaningless, while remaining involved in Middle Eastern politics is becoming more difficult. The fame surrounding him only increases the problem. People want to hear stories about the legendary desert commander, but Lawrence is not comfortable reducing his experiences to heroic adventures. He knows that the war was not a simple story of good versus evil. It involved competing ambitions, political promises, and people whose lives were changed forever. As time passes, Lawrence tries to distance himself from the public attention. He changes how he presents himself and looks for ways to live outside the enormous reputation attached to his name. Yet the legend follows him. Wherever he goes, people remember Lawrence of Arabia. The memories of the desert remain powerful. Lawrence remembers the long journeys, the friendships, the battles, and the moments when he believed that a different future was possible. He also remembers the people who trusted him and the responsibility he carried because of that trust. Sharif Ali's friendship remains one of the most important memories of his time in Arabia. Ali represented the world Lawrence entered and the people whose cause he came to support. Their relationship was built through hardship and mutual respect, and Lawrence knows that leaving Arabia means leaving behind a part of his identity. Meanwhile, the political results of the war continue developing. The Arab territories face new arrangements and foreign influence, while the dream of a unified, independent Arab state becomes increasingly complicated. Lawrence watches from a distance, knowing that the outcome is not what many of the fighters expected when they first joined the revolt. This realization creates a deep sense of disappointment. Lawrence had believed that courage and sacrifice could change history directly. Now he understands that history is also shaped by political power, negotiations, and decisions made far away from the battlefield. His greatest achievement has therefore become a source of mixed emotions. Lawrence knows that he helped defeat a powerful enemy and played a significant role in the Arab Revolt. But he also knows that victory did not automatically create the future he hoped for. As his military career moves toward its conclusion, Lawrence begins searching for a quieter existence. He wants to escape the constant attention and the expectations attached to his name. The legendary figure people admire is not necessarily the person Lawrence wants to remain. Yet, he cannot completely escape his past. The desert changed him, the war made him famous, and the political aftermath forced him to question what that fame and victory were truly worth. Lawrence now finds himself far removed from the desert where his legend was created. The war has ended, the Ottoman Empire has fallen, and the Arab Revolt has entered history. But Lawrence is still struggling with everything he experienced. The man who once seemed completely at home among the Arab fighters now finds ordinary life strangely difficult. He has become famous, yet the fame does not give him the peace he expected. Instead, it constantly reminds him of a past that he cannot completely leave behind. The stories about Lawrence continue spreading. Newspapers and military circles describe him as an extraordinary British officer who helped lead the Arab forces and played a major role in defeating the Ottoman Empire. His image becomes larger than the actual man. People are fascinated by his appearance, his unusual personality, his relationship with the desert, and the victories associated with his name. Lawrence, however, knows that the public version of his story leaves out many of the complicated truths he experienced. He remembers that the Arab Revolt was never simply an adventure. The people who followed him had their own reasons for fighting, their own families, tribes, ambitions, and hopes for the future. Lawrence had promised them that their struggle mattered. Now he knows that political decisions made after the war may prevent them from receiving the independence they expected. This realization weighs heavily on him because he feels personally connected to the promises that were made. Lawrence also begins to understand that he cannot return to the person he was before Arabia. Before the war, he was an unusual but relatively unknown officer. After the revolt, he became a legend. Even when he tries to step away from public attention, people continue recognizing his name. The identity of Lawrence of Arabia has become almost impossible to separate from T.E. Lawrence himself. His relationship with authority also changes. He once believed that serving Britain gave him a clear purpose. But the political aftermath of the war makes that belief more complicated. He has seen how governments can make promises for strategic reasons and change their priorities once victory is achieved. Lawrence becomes more skeptical of institutions and more aware of the gap between political language and reality. The memories of Prince Faisal remain especially important. Lawrence had hoped that Faisal could help create a strong Arab state after the Ottoman collapse. Instead, Faisal and his supporters faced difficult negotiations and foreign interference. Lawrence watches the political situation with concern, knowing that the people he fought beside are now dealing with problems that military victories cannot solve. Lawrence's emotional connection to the desert also remains strong. He remembers the enormous landscapes, the long journeys, and the sense of freedom he experienced there. In the desert, he felt that ordinary rules could be left behind and that he could become someone entirely different. Back in Britain, life feels more controlled and predictable, but it also feels less meaningful. He begins looking for ways to escape the attention surrounding him. Instead of embracing his fame, Lawrence tries to live more quietly. He wants to become anonymous, but his reputation makes that difficult. His experiences have already become part of public history, and people remain fascinated by the man behind the legend. Lawrence's internal conflict becomes clearer as he reflects on his achievements. He knows he accomplished extraordinary things, but he is not certain whether those achievements brought the results he wanted. The Arab Revolt helped defeat the Ottoman Empire, yet the political future of the region was shaped by forces far beyond his control. Lawrence begins questioning whether his role truly changed history or simply became one part of a much larger process. The people who admire him often see only courage and success. Lawrence remembers uncertainty and responsibility. He remembers moments when his decisions affected the lives of others. He understands that war creates legends by simplifying complicated experiences. The real person behind the legend must live with everything that the legend leaves out. As the years pass, Lawrence continues trying to find a place where he can live without constantly being defined by his wartime identity. He considers different forms of work and different ways of escaping public attention. He wants to build a life that belongs to him rather than to the newspapers and military stories surrounding his name. Yet, the desert remains part of him. He cannot forget the people who trusted him, the battles they fought together, or the dream of independence that brought them into the conflict. Even though he has left Arabia, the experience continues influencing how he understands loyalty, politics, courage, and identity. Lawrence's journey has therefore become less about military victories and more about understanding what those victories meant. He once believed that the greatest challenge was crossing the desert and defeating the enemy. Now he realizes that the greater challenge is living with the consequences of what he helped create. The people around him may continue calling him a hero, but Lawrence sees himself differently. He is a man who entered a war searching for purpose and emerged from it carrying a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. As he moves toward the final years of his story, Lawrence attempts to leave the legend behind and live as an ordinary man. But history has already decided that Lawrence of Arabia will never be ordinary again. Lawrence's extraordinary journey finally comes to its quiet and reflective conclusion. The war that transformed him is now far behind him, but the memories of Arabia remain deeply connected to his identity. The young British officer who once entered the desert as an outsider became one of the most famous figures of the Arab Revolt. He helped Prince Faisal's forces, crossed enormous distances, disrupted Ottoman supply lines, and played a major role in the campaign that eventually helped bring Ottoman rule in the region toward its end. Yet, despite these achievements, Lawrence's story is not remembered simply as a tale of military victory. It is also the story of a man who struggled to understand who he was after the war changed everything. The political outcome of the conflict remains complicated. Lawrence had hoped that the Arab people would gain the independence they believed they were fighting for, but the post war Middle East was shaped by powerful governments, negotiations, and competing interests. The promises made during wartime could not easily overcome the political ambitions of Britain and France. For Lawrence, this became one of the most painful lessons of his life. He had encouraged the Arab fighters to believe in a future of independence, and he later watched as that dream became much more difficult to achieve. Prince Faisal continued his political journey while the Arab leaders faced a future that was very different from the simple victory they had imagined. Lawrence remained sympathetic to Faisal and the Arab cause, but he could no longer influence events in the same way. His greatest power had existed during the war, when his knowledge, courage, and relationships with the tribes made him valuable. After the fighting ended, diplomacy replaced the desert campaign and Lawrence's influence became much smaller. Back in Britain, Lawrence struggled with the enormous reputation created around him. The world knew him as Lawrence of Arabia, a legendary figure who had crossed deserts and helped lead an extraordinary rebellion. Newspapers, books, and public discussions transformed his wartime experiences into a larger than life story. But Lawrence knew that the real events had been far more complicated. There had been fear, uncertainty, political disagreements, suffering, and difficult decisions that could not be captured by the heroic image people preferred. He increasingly wanted distance from that image. Lawrence did not want to spend the rest of his life being treated as a symbol. He wanted to experience ordinary life without constantly being reminded of the war. He tried different forms of service and adopted quieter identities, hoping that anonymity might give him some freedom. Yet, the legend was too powerful to disappear completely. The memories of Sharif Ali and the Arab fighters remain especially important to him. Ali had been more than a companion during the campaign. He represented the world Lawrence had entered and the people whose struggle had changed his understanding of loyalty and identity. Their friendship had been forged through dangerous journeys and shared hardships. Even after leaving Arabia, Lawrence could not simply forget the people who had trusted him. Lawrence also continued carrying the contradictions created by his wartime role. He had served Britain while supporting an Arab revolt that sought independence. He had become deeply connected to the Arab people while never completely escaping his identity as a British officer. He had been celebrated as a hero while privately questioning whether his actions had produced the future he wanted. These contradictions became part of the reason his story remained so fascinating. In the final stages of his life, Lawrence tried to live away from the spotlight. He enjoyed the quietness of ordinary activities and preferred distance from public attention. Yet, the world continued remembering the famous figure created by the war. His name remained connected to Arabia, the desert, and the extraordinary campaign that had made him famous. The story eventually returns to the beginning, where Lawrence's death has already been mentioned. The people attending his memorial remember him in different ways. Some admire his courage, while others question his personality and motives. Their conflicting opinions reveal an important truth about Lawrence. Nobody could completely define him. He was a soldier, but he did not always think like a traditional soldier. He was a British officer, yet he became deeply connected to an Arab struggle. He was celebrated as a hero, but he understood the complicated cost of war. And he became a legend even though he spent much of his later life trying to escape that legend. Lawrence's journey through Arabia ultimately changes the course of his own life as much as it changes the way others see him. He enters the desert searching for purpose and emerges as a symbol recognized around the world. But the political consequences of the war teach him that military victory does not automatically create justice. and fame does not necessarily bring happiness. His story ends not with another battle, but with reflection. The desert that once represented freedom becomes a memory, while the man who became Lawrence of Arabia remains trapped between history and legend. His greatest achievements cannot be separated from the political complications surrounding them, and his identity cannot be reduced to the heroic image created by others. Looking back, Lawrence's life becomes a powerful reminder that history is rarely simple. Wars are not fought only by governments and armies. They are shaped by individuals, friendships, promises, ambitions, and decisions whose consequences may continue long after the fighting ends. T.E. Lawrence entered the desert as a relatively unknown British officer. He left it as one of the most unforgettable figures of the First World War. His legend survived because his story combined courage, mystery, ambition, sacrifice, and contradiction. And even after the desert disappeared behind him, Lawrence of Arabia remained a man searching for a place where the legendary hero and the real human being could finally become one. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this review, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing movie breakdowns. See you in the next video.